it's really hard work to find a new use for a medicine. I mean, it's not easy to repurpose drugs, but artificial intelligence actually allows us to look across all drugs and all diseases and come up with an early estimate or prediction in terms of how likely a drug might treat a disease. So then us humans can then dig in further and figure out, is that drug really likely to help? When we first ran this algorithm for the first time, the Matrix took about 100 days to generate all 75 million scores. It now takes our team about 17 hours to generate the same scores with the same sort of confidence and reliability and recall and accuracy.
Welcome to AI in Healthcare. My name is Dr. Sanjay Juneja. I'm a hematologist medical oncologist, also known as the ArcDoc on social media. And we have a very special episode today. I met Dr. David Fajgenbaum in the Google Summit. I think it was the inaugural one for the future of AI and cancer and really in healthcare. And the thing that I found so amazing, and I'm going to spare you the story, but you basically were in a position recognizing that you had a very rare disease and you were told there were no options as deemed appropriate or valid on what the current system is. It's like you study it, you have the FDA, you have all these other things, and it saved your life. And since then, you have saved many, and on the New York Times, I believe, cover because of your recognition that, hey, why don't we leverage and subsidize the efforts and costs of things that we have done previously to help people today? And it's a very unique angle because usually on this podcast, we're talking about very expensive things that are costly and the next big thing. And you're like, can we just go back to the basics? So, you have a profound history. You're an immunologist. You're Ivy League with none of the ego, respectfully. You're great. You're a good human. All that said, thank you for being here so much, David.
Sanjay, thanks so much for having me.
So one of the first things I wanted to talk about, again, you are repurposing current medications as well as what their mechanisms are to be able to say, our body physiologically is a closed circuit. There's some absolute truths that have to happen regardless of where you are and who you are. Can you walk us through this concept of drug repurposing and really like how you see it unfolding, how it has, and how you see it unfolding to hopefully give people more treatments, better control of disease without having to reinvent the wheel?
Yeah, absolutely. So drug repurposing describes this process of taking already approved drugs and trying to find new uses for them. And it's based on the fact that, as you said earlier, many diseases may appear very different, but they actually can share the same underlying problem in the body. And so therefore the same drug can actually treat multiple diseases. And also drugs can oftentimes hit multiple targets in the body at once. And so for those reasons, there's just tremendous untapped potential for our approved medicines. And this isn't a new concept. I'm sure the listeners have probably heard about how Viagra was repurposed from heart disease to its current well-known use. But the listeners may not have heard that Viagra has also been repurposed for a rare pediatric lung disease called pulmonary arterial hypertension. So children that were dying before their teenage years are now living full lives on Viagra. And that's not just something that's, special to Viagra. Drugs like thalidomide, caused horrible birth defects, but then were repurposed for leprosy and the cancer of multiple myeloma. And if you looked at leprosy and myeloma, you'd say there's nothing similar. Well, it turns out there are mechanisms that are shared between them. And so this idea isn't new, but what had not been done before was to have any entity looking systematically across all the drugs we've got and all the horrible diseases that affect humanity and looking for matches across them. And there's a few reasons why it wasn't happening. The most obvious one is finances. So 80% of drugs are already generic, which means that you could sell millions more doses of a generic drug and you might make thousands of dollars, maybe. And so the economics just don't add up. No one does any R&D on trying to find new uses for generic medicines. And those are the medicines that are most widely available. They're the most affordable. They're the ones that we know the best. Those are the very drugs that we don't study. The other reason that this hasn't happened is that it's really hard work to find a new use for a medicine. I mean, it's not easy to repurpose drugs, especially if you go one drug, one disease at a time, which is what my lab's been doing a lot of over the last decade. But artificial intelligence actually allows us to look across all drugs and all diseases and come up with an early estimate or prediction in terms of how likely a drug might treat a disease. So then us humans can then dig in further and figure out, is that drug really likely to help? So it's both the finances and then also the lack of the technology that have gotten us to where we are today. And of course, Every Cure is the nonprofit that I set up. So we don't need to be profitable. Actually, we can go after the nonprofit opportunities, and we leverage artificial intelligence to help us to focus in on the opportunities to help people the best.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. You're saying like, y'all, this is the most available. Like these things are made, like, if not super costly. And would you go as far as to say it's almost like an examination or a respect to side effects? Because the reason that we have side effects is because we have toolkits that, express in every cell. They use different pieces and parts of it. But the same goes for any inherent disease process. So it's not like it's a virus that our body doesn't know or hasn't seen, or bacteria. We're talking about something that's happening, within our body, which in your case was Castleman's. Is that kind of into consideration of sometimes the first thing being like, hey, let's take this side effect and make it something that is actually potentially valuable?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we call something a side effect because it's something that happens in a disease that happened to be the first disease that you study. But what if another was the first disease that you studied, or another disease was the first disease got approved? Then maybe what it was approved for might be considered sort of a side effect. And so, yeah, I think it's this recognition that the drugs we have can treat many more diseases than they currently do. And of course, for me, as you know, it was sort of blaring in my face because I had this horrible disease, Castleman's, and nearly died 5 times. And to your point, I didn't have $1 billion in 10 years to create some new drug, right? If I had a few months and I had basically no money to try to find a drug to save me. And so it was just very crystal clear for me. I was like, okay, if I want to save my life, it has to be with something that's already out there. And I ended up discovering this drug, sirolimus, that saved my life. And that just set me on this path to be like, wait a minute, if I'm alive because of a drug that was made for my disease that no one else knew to try, like how many other drugs are there out there? And we've gone on to repurpose a number of additional drugs through my center, but now artificial intelligence can take this to a whole nother level.
And you're, with this concept, you've built this matrix platform, if
That's
I'm
right. Yep.
it correctly, where you're identifying potential treatments for diseases like ALS and autism spectrum disorder, even, which is a challenge and one of more topic recently, or conversation. How my biggest fear, and I have a couple that I lose sleep over, maybe even have IBS. I'm like, how do we prove, or how do we make sure that the potential of AI isn't slowed down, not because it was reckless, but just from over vigilance? How does this process look like when you're doing AI prediction to actual clinical application? And what are some of the challenges arising when we're translating this into patient care?
Yeah, great question. So we use this platform, we call it Matrix, to look across the world's knowledge of every drug, every disease, every gene, every protein. It's basically all of the world's knowledge in what's called a biomedical knowledge graph. So it's a 2-dimensional representation of what we know about medicine. And then we train algorithms on known treatments. Like we know siltuximab treats Castleman disease. So we train on that relationship. We train on other relationships, literally thousands that we know. And then we ask the algorithm, look across every other drug versus every other disease and give us a score from 0 to 1 for how likely it is that you think that drug's going to work for that disease based on what we trained you on. And so we get things that are close to 0, which means that are unlikely to work, and things close to 1.99s that the algorithm thinks are likely to work. And so we do that across all 4,000 drugs, all 18,000 diseases. So it's about 75 million scores that we generate. And then us humans can look at the things that score highly. Like, what is AI saying is likely to work? Us humans can look at the top. And what's interesting is that we thought we were going to mostly be finding sort of new discoveries. We published in the New England Journal of Medicine a couple months ago, identifying that a TNF inhibitor might be useful in Castleman disease. We treated a patient with it. It saved his life. And so that was a discovery. That was novel. Humans hadn't figured that out yet. But what I've been really surprised to find is that we actually are uncovering a lot of things that us humans actually have already found. We just had discarded because it's not profitable. And so an example of that, I wouldn't say fully discarded, but at least haven't taken forward. An example actually is within autism. It turns out that a large portion of kids with autism have antibodies that prevent folate from getting in their brain. They have a cerebral folate deficiency. And there's a medicine called leucovorin, which bypasses that cerebral folate deficiency and goes through what's called the RFC, the reduced folate channel. And you actually get folate into these kids' brains. And there have been 3 randomized controlled trials showing improvement in verbal communication in these kids. It's by no means a cure. It's by no means, all of those, words that we all look for. But it certainly helps to improve communication in kids that have autism, which is meaningful. And there's been really no uptake at all of this medicine, and there's a blood testing to help to predict cases that are likely to benefit. And so this highlights how when you use an all versus all approach, look across every drug and every disease, I never would have said like, let's focus on this disease or this drug and let's see what we find the match for. But if you take this completely disease and drug agnostic approach, you can let the algorithm and let AI tell you where to focus. And what I think is exciting about that, to your point, is that you've got some cases like adalimumab for Castleman's where it's, it's a stretch, it's a discovery, like, really, hold on to your safety belts while you're deciding whether to try this in humans. And that's the stretch of AI. But also AI is really good at just finding patterns and things that us humans have already found, but putting a spotlight on it, saying, you humans, you should look more here. And I think that's much lower risk, right? It's not like the trials have already been done, or in some cases the work's going on, but this is pointing it out to us and saying, you should focus more here.
That's incredible. And to that point, my second question for you is actually going to be one that maybe you don't get to talk about enough, but I think it might excite you as a immunologist. And that's really, it's a page out of Eric Topol's book on or thinking process, is that we also don't consider things that may be extremely relevant and actually account for some of the, confounded results or the kind of variability on response possibility. One being just like your blood type, right? And you have these antigens and you have this entire process. You have the immune system that is learned, right? And humoral and antibody related. But then you have this innate immunity that has to do with the things that are just, I don't want to call them the peons, but they're the people that just float around and they're not necessarily, maybe college educated. And this is a loose example. I hope no one gets their feelings hurt being an innate immunity, advocate. But that also stresses me out on the hematology end, because we know that they might have some implication on several things, on antiviral therapies or even on cancer treatments. How do we take into consideration these things, and what are some of the things that need to happen so we can even start exploring or feed, quote unquote, this computational power to be able to just really humble us and give us deeper insights?
Oh, that's another great question. Related to personalized and precision medicine, which, as you mentioned, is something that Eric is a real leader in. I think that the example with autism is maybe a worthwhile one to double click on a little bit further. So you can determine whether someone's likely to respond to leucovorin by doing a blood test, and it looks for antibodies against the folate receptor alpha, because if you have antibodies against folate receptor alpha, you're likely not getting any folate through your choroid plexus into your brain. And so this is an example where you can do a blood test. It can tell you, whether you're likely to respond or not. And that blood test is important, because if you're likely to respond, maybe you should take it. If you're not likely to respond, maybe you shouldn't take it. Same sort of, you can imagine that, but any biomarker, whether it's blood type or antibody status or genetic status. And so I think that we can use AI to help us to understand what are the new uses for medicines generally. It points us to, and us humans can review and say, leucovorin for autism. But then you really need to start nailing down and getting into subtypes, because to your point, no drug works for everyone with a given disease. And there's always confounders, and there's always subtypes and biomarkers, and there's so much more complexity to it. So I think that where we are right now is that I think AI can direct us well to general opportunities, but I think us humans are still, we still need to be part of this and figuring out, who are the exact patients that should benefit from this medicine.
Yeah. And part of it that again stresses me out is like, we know the concept of having different medications on board, and sometimes whether it's monopolizing the thing that breaks it down, which either makes it active or makes it go away, that it obviously influences. And we have a general idea of what influences what based on just the kind of practical scientific understanding of what breaks down and what doesn't. But then you're talking about how even somebody being on intermittent steroids for, say, an autoimmune disease, what it does to the immune system and the lymphocytes. And now you might get these false doesn't works, when in fact it's because of the steroids. I'm sure that's a stressful point for you too. And the solution is challenging, because one, it requires people to share kind of all of the variables, number one, and number two, all the variables they don't even realize that need to be shared, because the only way we know, what the mind can know what the eyes haven't seen, is to really feed it. And what are kind of your thoughts surrounding this, and how are you, if at all, tackling these other considerations that are kind of existing in an orbit outside of the current goals, but hopefully can foster an understanding to, a greater depth?
Oh yeah. It's such a good question, and I think that tackling problems and addressing problems with a hypothesis for how to solve them is sort of how we've always done things in science and medicine. To your point, you've sort of, I guess, used the analogy like what your eyes have seen. You have an idea for what you think might be a solution. You come with a hypothesis, you test it. But I think that things get really exciting when you don't come in with hypotheses and you let the data tell you. Let the data tell you that that lidocaine for breast cancer looks really promising versus you would have never thought to look at lidocaine or breast cancer, right? And you wouldn't have thought to necessarily understand, what's a biomarker or cell population that maybe is likely to represent the people who really will benefit versus will not. So I think that it's always been exciting to think that way, but it's often been challenging to have the tools to do that kind of work. And I can just share from a compute perspective with what we're doing. There's 4,000 approved drugs. There's about 18,000 human diseases. So as I shared earlier, there's about 75 million possibilities for every drug versus every disease. And, a lab like mine here at Penn, we can do really good work, one drug, one disease at a time. Give us a few months, we can really evaluate it, do a trial. We can move that one drug for one disease in a few years. But we've certainly never been able to think about 75 million possibilities simultaneously. And just fast forward to even just a couple of years ago, when we first ran this algorithm for the first time, the matrix, took about 100 days to generate all 75 million scores. It took a lot of compute, a lot of time. It now takes our team about 17 hours to generate the same scores with the same sort of confidence and reliability and recall and accuracy. And that's just in the last 2 years. And so you think about up until 3 or 4 years ago, humans were doing it and we couldn't get through 75 million years, right? To get through all those possibilities, or at least thousands of years. And then, fast forward a couple of years ago, now it's 100 days, and now we're into, one day at a time. And that's to look across every drug and every disease and the world's knowledge of everything to come up with these scores. And it's only going to get better and better. And when you can do that rapidly, that's when you can start looking for things that we don't even know to look for. And I think that's so exciting.
That's incredible. I mean, it's the same way that, and not the same way actually, but a much smaller form of when the internet came out, right?
Yeah.
For me, like in the 90s. You can't even start to conceive what you can do with it until decades later, right?
Yes.
I mean, still, people only recently in the last 5 years are making full thriving livings on social media. That's like, this, that, and the other, all that really has the same concept of the internet. So, and it takes an evolution. It takes decades. But when we're talking about diseases and challenges to human existence, it's almost like this anxiety of like making sure you feed it to not take decades, because there are lives within those decades, within those year or two. And and you've, very humbly, like I know how humble you are, I can say firsthand, just save people that like, if you didn't have this experience at the time you had it and didn't go into what you were getting, people are alive or not. And that's the anxiety I have like on the cancer realm as well. So with all that said, I would love to talk about for a second, or more than a second, about this concept of an open source platform. You are, democratizing, the word meaning like give access to everybody, on drug discovery and developing an open source drug repurposing database. How does something like that, well, one, if there's a 30-second explanation of what that exactly means, which I know, but listeners may not, what does that mean, and how do you envision this tool empowering researchers and clinicians worldwide? And I would even go as far as to say set a precedent for possibly other open source sharings so that we can understand, challenges of the human existence as a whole rather than be revenue driven.
So we use these knowledge graphs to generate scores for every drug versus every disease, and it requires a tremendous amount of compute and also a lot of really complicated AI skills and personnel. And we get a score for every drug versus every disease. All 75 million of those scores that I mentioned took 100 days previously, and now it takes 17 hours. And we use those scores to decide as a nonprofit, Every Cure, that nonprofit, to decide which matches to go forward, which ones need more lab work, which ones need clinical trials, which ones do we need to just advocate and educate around. So that's what we, the nonprofit, use them for. But to your point, we also felt like the world should just have access to these scores. Like if we can find things that look promising and that can drive us as a nonprofit, we should just give those away to the world. But rather than giving away like the knowledge graph and figuring out how to like, good luck, coming up with these scores, we're like, why don't we just give the scores? And so in about a year's time, every one of those 75 million scores will be available for the world to utilize. And so you can imagine if you're a researcher in Parkinson's disease, you might type in Parkinson's and say like, what are the 4,000 drugs that are currently approved for anything, and what's the rank order for what might be useful for Parkinson's? And it might be that the number one drug on that list looks really promising, and you might want to go study in the lab, or it might be the number 5 thing on the list. There's already anecdotal reports of people have been getting it in their case studies that maybe has helped kids, patients with Parkinson's. And so, there's going to be varying levels of evidence for all these things. The vast majority, of course, there's going to be no evidence whatsoever, and they're going to get scored low. But for a lot of these, they're going to be really high. And you as a scientist or as a physician or as a patient are now armed with this information that you can then take forward.
That's extraordinary. And thank you again for setting that precedent. I think it's a concept that we just direly need, because it only fuels, like achieving like livelihood and decreasing morbidity, et cetera. I think it's humanistic, it's charitable, it's the right thing to do, especially, with the Pope passing, because he very much reflected, love of the people.
Yes.
And I think it gives me goosebumps with the timeliness. All that said, without getting emotional, my next question is one I also did not pre-planned. And it's because firsthand, I have a very good friend going through something with very limited data. Like he's still in his, he's my age, grew up with him, and has primary peritoneal mesothelioma. And I'm trying to be as sensitive as possible, being, the podcast host of Target Cancer Podcast, where we had a bunch of innovation and new things and all this stuff, but respecting the relationship with the major academic institution, what the guidelines currently say. And that's hard, because it's like when you're talking about somebody's life, and especially that individual, it's like you're getting to this juxtaposition of, do I take what the specialist says of today based on what we know, or do I take like innovation and AI and go there? And regardless of the outcome, even if they're the same, you don't want to leave them and their loved ones with this thought of, should I have done the other one, right? And that's a challenge. How do you see, and this is not your job because you're doing amazing things to fuel this, but it gives me concern that patients then will be able to go here and say, look, I have some good evidence, or at least good reason to believe this, and you're telling me there's no alternative, and yet kind of being at a dead end of possibly the warmth of exploring this to keep their loved one alive. How does this unfold in your mind? And only what you want to share, because, there's socialized thoughts, there's all kinds of stuff, but that's what also stresses me out. And I say this because the recent study, there's some data showing, AI outperforms physicians in these capacities and don't. But the thing that was remarkable was, at least currently, when together, which is what we boast, it's going to be used, together and synergistic, it would actually made things worse. And part of it was just the rejection, or the rejection of even correct information due to hypervigilance or distrust or mistrust or whatever. That's also a concern of mine, is like, then how do we get all this insight and then actually get adoption? And should patients have, a means to be able to access the stuff that you're fueling?
Yeah, it's the right question to ask. I mean, the first part of this journey, when a patient does come to the website, is going to need to be education around, these are predictions that are not necessarily going to work for your disease. And we use these predictions to then do research. I mean, at every cure, we use these scores to then say, this is what we're going to study in the lab, so we're going to study in clinical trials. It's not, this is what we're going to now use. And so I think we need to do the right education to share what these scores mean. And then, of course, communicate that it's, of course, you and your doctor's decision around what treatments you may or may not receive. And I think there's also this interesting part around a bit of education around physicians, and that I bring humbly to you and your listeners, and that's that 1/4 of all prescriptions written every day in the U.S. are off-label. And so, not being approved by the FDA for particular use does not mean that it can't be prescribed, and it certainly doesn't mean that you're not already prescribing it. 1/4 of prescriptions are off-label. there's just a wide range of what off-label means, right? There's doxycycline for Lyme disease. That's off-label. No one ever did the work to get doxycycline approved for Lyme disease, right? Not surprising. It's because there's no money to be made off of something like that, right? Doxycycline's cheap and generic. So if it's a cheap generic drug, then no one's going to ever do the work to get a label change. And so I spent a lot of time with folks from the FDA, and there seems to be a disconnect. Clinicians often say, well, it's not approved for that use, and therefore it may not be useful. Whereas the FDA will say, our job is not to determine whether something is useful or not. Our job is to determine whether drug companies are allowed to market the drug for that use. Our job is literally to regulate drug companies on marketing. Your job as a clinician is actually to treat your patients however you think you should treat them. And of course, off-label use is part of medicine. And it's really up to the doctor to decide how to prescribe. And of course, in oncology, there's no area where there's more off-label use in oncology. Of course, about 50% of NCCN guidelines are off-label. Now, what you brought up earlier is not just off-label, but also even off guidelines. And that's where even the guidelines aren't recommending it. And that's, of course, more tricky. But it's still off-label. There's still no regulation against its use. And it really comes down to the benefit risk. And each patient's benefit risk profile is going to be different because they're a different stage of their disease and a different disease. And it's just really complicated. So the first point is let's educate our patients so they understand what these scores mean. Let's educate physicians or at least empower physicians to feel like they understand how this information can or is not, can be useful, maybe cannot be useful. And then I think it's really about making sure that the physician and the patient can understand what is that, what's that level of evidence where it's a yes and what's the level of evidence where it's a no, and then make those decisions, together.
Yeah, one of the kind of fortunate or unfortunate, I say mostly unfortunate realities is a lot of things have to come down to bottom dollar. Like
Yep.
it's the way it is. It's the way our system's built. It is what it is. Like, so,
Yep.
neutral. But to your point, a lot of these, they are generic, so they're fortunately not cost prohibitive. But the adoption and maybe the security of its insight and what it's suggesting is something that you don't want to make a patient uncomfortable with. One interesting concept I heard is really the involvement of not necessarily even payers, because they might actually save money when it comes to admissions and debility and chronic, wellness, when you can possibly get away with it with something that's less expensive. But also life insurance companies to where, they're obviously incentivized to keep somebody alive. And again, I scoff, but we all have it. And therefore it could actually be profoundly cost saving to be able to have the involvement. Do you have any of these kind of like thoughts, ideas, or almost like reworking of stuff to be able to say, hey, this is a way we can actually get someone to do the work, to take the time and the investment, to be able to hopefully have a better landscape of chronic and debilitating disease care by just doing this, working the system the way it's worked?
Sanjay, I have to admit, all I've done is think about drug repurposing for the last 10 years, and I have not once thought about life insurance, and it's a brilliant idea. I thought that we were getting innovative and thinking about ways to work with health insurance companies, because to your point, like there's cost savings, potentially for them, but there's also all of these reasons why they may not do it. Well, they don't have that person for more than 2 or 3 years. But life insurance, we have not thought about it, but I love it. And we will think about it some more, and I will turn to you for more amazing ideas, because I do think that that is a group where if we can save lives, there's full alignment. I love it.
They're truly incentivized to keep you alive, right? And well, and so it just takes sometimes, as you are the king of thinking outside the box of how can we make sure that what can be is. So I just think that's really cool. So if we were to think kind of looking ahead and prospectively on a similar note, how do you see AI transforming the landscape of rare disease treatment in general? Because you're doing that with generics, and you're doing that with diseases that are well known, but maybe a lot left to be desired. And to piggyback that, what emerging technologies that could actually either catalyze, augment, or diversify what you're already doing do you get excited about that could say that, where you're saying, if only this, then we could do this, and this could be conceived or possible?
Oh, these are great questions. When we think about all drugs, all diseases, of course, every disease, every rare disease is included within within our platform and our approach. And at the same time, we recognize that it's unlikely that for a lot of diseases that there's a drug that already exists that could be repurposed for that rare disease or that common disease. So for a given disease, whether it's Castleman's or you name it, there's a low likelihood that there's some, but likely low likelihood that there's some drug that already exists. But when you look across everything, you're likely to find things shoots through the roof, and there's high likelihood you're going to find opportunities. But what that means is that for any given rare disease, there may or may not be a repurposed drug that's just waiting to help you. I personally have the mindset that if it's there, we have a moral obligation to find it, and that we have a moral obligation as a society to find all these opportunities, because I don't think someone should suffer if there's a treatment that's a local pharmacy, period. And also we have to keep, that sort of understanding and open mind that there actually might not be something at the pharmacy for your given disease. But the more that we can get through, the more of these repurposing opportunities we can go one by one through across these diseases, the more likely that we're going to get to that disease that affects you. And so in terms of your second question around what's that technology that I think would really get us to the next level, I think that it's hard to point to just one. I think that the real value of every cure is to not be focused on a single modality or a single disease or a single drug, and just say, among the things that are out there, both drugs and horrible diseases, what are the best matches? Now, of course, the more drugs that get approved, the more things that we have to match. But I think that many of us are really optimistic about ASOs, and of course, still very hopeful for gene therapies for a number of rare diseases. But I think that if we can keep moving all of these platform technologies forward, and then we can also make sure that every cure is always looking across all of these new approvals and all these diseases, I think we can, really create, and help people in ways that we never could have imagined.
Yeah. And I think, if there were certain bottlenecks that would be most desirable to be able to do, let's just say, with cost removed and some of those red tape and barriers, would a patient-facing adoption or not buy-in, not even investment, nothing monetarily, would a patient's will and volition to be able to share the what's and the whys, and maybe not even the what's and whys, but the what happens, that to me is something that's potentially very valuable. Because if there's some way to get everyone to say, yo, I want to help people that are half Punjabi like myself and half Assamese, and also, with the different faculties of what I have and don't have, how that would be very ideal, right? And is that something that's actually even possible, to where at least within every cure, that people can say, look, have what you need so I can help others and have this discovery? Or is it mostly the people that have the diseases and got treatments that basically the matrix and all of the scientific stuff behind it is able to get insights from?
I think it sort of gets down to this idea of when you think about repurposing or saving lives with existing medicines, you can do it in a patient-driven or anchored on the patient, specific patient fashion. You can do it anchored on a specific disease, or you can do what we do, where we call it all-over-all drug repurposing, or computational pharmacogenomics, which is our fancy long term. And so patient-centric or patient-anchored is where you come to me with your condition and your medical records and your experience and your omic data, and say, what could help me? And that's, of course, what we did to save my life with Castleman's disease. Is very hyper-specific. The next level would be disease specific, where you'd say, I'm coming to you with POEMS syndrome. I want you to find something from POEMS syndrome, right? And then there's a third approach, which is what we do, which is this all versus all, where we don't start by saying, what's the right drug for this particular person, this profile, or what's even the right drug for this disease. We start by saying, let's let the data look across everything versus everything, all drugs versus all diseases, and just find the particular opportunities that look promising, and then dig into what's the right subgroup and who is the right patient to benefit from that drug. And so it's just a reshifting away from this sort of, a patient coming to us and saying, what do I do, to us looking across the world's knowledge and saying, this is going to be great, now let's go take it to patients. And I think that this approach is just much more likely to have success with every attempt. And ideally we make so much progress in this third approach, we can start getting into the other two.
And because I know people are getting more enthusiastic of saying hey, I want to not necessarily disrupt to disrupt, but if the healthcare system can be more servicing, more affordable, and just more accurate that they want to
Yep.
do it. And I'm talking about necessarily ill or even medical professional people, just people in general invest in this concept. So this might be something you've gotten before. And I know you, with the character that you have, would love to be able to say, yes, this is what we're looking at. But what are your thoughts behind what I think you would agree, the validity that there are things that are not manufactured or necessarily drugs that are discovered, but still of potential aid and benefit when it comes to the inflammatory system, autoimmune disease. And I'm talking in the way of herbals and supplements and these
Yep.
things that somewhat justifiably, a lot of Americans feel wary of towards at least the scientific
Yep.
discovery process. Is there something built internally where you can even consider these supplements and herbals to see what difference they make or even solutions they bring?
Yeah, this is a really important question because, from my perspective, we shouldn't care what a compound is approved for or where it came from in terms of whether we think it's going to work or not. My drug, sirolimus, was discovered on the soil of the island of Rapa Nui. And when researchers first discovered it, they thought it might be a good antifungal drug. It was really bad at being an antifungal. It's just not an antifungal, but it's a really good mTOR inhibitor. And of course, it got approval for organ transplantation, and now it's saving my life for Castleman disease and saving other people's lives for Castleman's and other conditions. And so what something was initially intended for by a scientist and where it came from, I think should be just totally irrelevant. It's, what's the compound and what can it do? And so in terms of how do we empower that? Well, first off, we like to start with FDA-approved medicines because those are the things that we can write prescriptions for. We can get them at CVS. I think that's the lowest of the low-hanging fruit. And interestingly, FDA-approved medicines actually do include a number of vitamins and things that you might think would not be included. So I mentioned earlier leucovorin for this subtype or subgroup of kids with autism who have this folate receptor antibodies. Leucovorin is just folinic acid, which is just a derivative of folic acid or folate, which is, of course, in everything that we eat and all of our multivitamins. But it needs to be folinic acid. It can't be folic acid or folate. It has to be folinic acid to go through this reduced folate transport channel. And so that's an example where it's a vitamin and we're finding a new use for it. And there's a lot of data about it because it's also been manufactured as a pharmaceutical product. But the next step after these compounds that are FDA approved pharmaceutical products, regardless where they came from, is to start looking at what those supplements and those vitamins are, and then even going into the things that never even got an FDA approval for anything. Maybe they were phase 3 failures. They failed for lupus, but they'd be a great drug for Sjogren's or who knows what it is. And so I think that for us, we want to start lowest hanging fruit is already FDA approved drugs at your CVS, and then start working our way down.
And I guess part of the reason for that, just so if anyone's understanding, they're like, yes, and especially during the Target Cancer podcast, which is what this was called before, they were like, why don't you talk about about that, et cetera? And a lot of it is because the investment wasn't there to necessarily see these things play out. But now that AI can do it, I need everyone to understand the problem is, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I very well could be, but because none of these are FDA approved, it's not that they don't work, like you said. It's just like what you can market it for. But what it does do is have now this issue of what you're being told you're getting and the dosing is completely unsubstantiable or it cannot be substantiated. And that's the issue because, I hate almost like it's overly simplistic but it's a needed phrase, which is bad data in is bad data out.
Yeah.
My point being is maybe this list we're coming up with of things that we would love to see happen is one of them just having some regulatory body on saying, this piece of data, if it's acquires certain or something like that one time a guest told me about, and these other things, this is a valid actual concentration. Like that in itself would at least open the lid tremendously on talking about what potential additive, synergistic, prohibitive effects that these things are going to happen. But correct me if I'm wrong, until that happens, we're going by something that very well could be fallible or just, make the machine go haywire because you're being told the same dosage between 3 brands and you're not getting the same dosage.
Yeah, I think that's one huge part is that you don't know the validity of any substance you get that is a supplement. You just don't. It may not even have that that compound in it. It may just be something else entirely. It's not regulated. And so one is the thing that you think you're getting actually the thing? That's one question. But the other is that because it's a supplement, because you can get a GNC, and because insurance doesn't cover it, and because it's not at a pharmacy, there's no financial incentive for anyone to do the big trials to prove that these things work. And so not only do you not really know, is that really the right dose, is you also don't even know what the right dose is, because no one's ever going to do the big trial of that supplement, because no one's going to ever make money off of it. And so that's where we as a nonprofit want to come in and take some of these things forward. It might be an amino acid that you can get a GNC, but maybe we will do the big trial to prove that it works in this new condition. And then now, as long as we can figure out which of those products have the highest quality and the most likely to be the right dose, then we can start thinking about using those medicines more. And so, yeah, it's both. You don't really know what you're getting, but you also, because it's supplement, you just didn't get the sort of rigorous trials that are done for pharmaceutical products. And so it's tough.
It really is. So if I can ask you just, and I hate these questions when I'm a guest on something, but like if there's one or two things, and I'm trying to make it flexible, that you are most excited about that really expand what it is you're doing, whether it's philosophically, economically, whether it's open source sharing stuff, what are those one or two things? And or if there are one or two things that you have a fear would make a premature opposition to using AI in science and medicine, then I have a couple of those fears where I'm like, this is something that could just really slow everything down because it would be an unfair, criticism or conclusion. Either of those, I would love to know in your mind when you're, in bed or in the shower, is where at least I get my thinking done of those kind of either concerns or hopes that would make you very happy.
Yeah, I mean, the hope for sure and the excitement comes from this idea that we can scan the world's knowledge of every drug and every disease in ways that us humans couldn't do, to find opportunities to help people. And taking this unbiased approach, I think is just so exciting. And it's, I'm biased because this is what I got to do every day, but I think the impact for us humans is just going to be immense, and it's already starting to prove out. So that's what I'm excited about, is just, using AI to look across everything all at once, as opposed to, the typical, sniper shot that we used to take. I think in terms of concerns, I'm definitely concerned about if a patient uses a medicine that we put out on our matrix scores as a result of that, because it's on the website, and then have some sort of problem as a result of it. I mean, we aren't doing this for any reason other than just to help people. Like, that's literally why we spend all day, every day working like crazy, is to help as many people as possible. And so the last thing we would ever want is for there to be any harm that was done as a result of it. So I think that's what scares me, is harm being caused by using a medicine that is scored and has research data behind it, but isn't, sort of ready for prime time. I think that my hope is that clinicians, who are the ones who ultimately write the prescription, will be empowered with the information they need to be able to make those tough decisions.
Yeah, and but respectfully, I mean, it's nothing new, if not at all any different than what medicine is and it always has been. I mean,
totally.
I even explained, like, the chemos, when I say trial sometimes to certain populations, they get very worried, like, I want, be experiment, get a big. I'm like, dude, I get it, because there was terrible things
Horrible
that happened
things done.
For phase ones. It's like, do you live or do you die? Like, that was our phase ones before, right?
Yep.
And now, and then phase two is like, okay, does it work? And now it's very different. A lot of it is, it's standard of care plus or minus a thing. And the second part of that is there is no shortage of toxicities with the treatments we give already.
Yep.
So to your point, it's like you're like, I incur moral injury because it wasn't a guy, I didn't say it. But we do live in a world, on the flip side, also, that we can actually learn in a way that we've never been able to learn before. And that's the whats and the whys. And, I will never, be able to allege that I could say this without actually being in the situation, that you've been in, and many others. But I would like to believe that as a scientist, I'd be very enthusiastic about, like, something that could bring us better insight, for good or positive, and give me a better probability than the existing landscape. I think that's a hard one to walk away from, at least. But again, I would never, I don't want to overstate anything, because I can't imagine the sensitive, position that it requires to be there. Only if I have 5 more minutes of your time, I would love to ask you, and I've never asked anyone this on a podcast. It's not crazy, I promise. Sometimes I have a concern or worry that, especially when it comes to rheumatology, no offense, rheumatologist, But even in some of these more nebulous disease processes, it's the way we define the process is still at the limitation of our understanding of variables and context that we had at the time that
Yep.
we defined. So poems, like cute little acronym, not cute disease, very horrific.
No.
I'm not undermining it. Like Castleman's, etc. I mean, these things are based on markers and diagnostics that we had forever ago. And then
70 years.
rheumatology,
Yeah.
what's that?
Yeah. Like 70 years ago.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then rheumatology is somewhat similarly. It's like it's this, that, and the other. What do you think in the context of actually redefining our diagnoses rather than piggybacking very obtuse, you have 5 primary colors to paint with versus my kids have like 64 colors and I couldn't name 10 if you made me.
Yep.
How is that in our future to really be able to characterize these more, especially when it comes to autoimmune and inflammation? When you learn about superantigens and things that can catalyze this process, it's very possible, I would guess, that Castleman's is happening for 2 distinct reasons and 2 distinct superantigens that are just basically catalyzing the inherent immunologic process, but for different reasons, right? And so what does that look like? And is that something that you're putting on your plate for one day, or are you just like, let somebody else do it?
It's so important. And you can almost imagine that some of the work we're doing around response to therapies could even guide some of this. So like if someone with Castleman's disease responds to an IL-6 blocker, they'd probably have an IL-6opathy. One that responds to an mTOR inhibitor probably has, an issue with mTOR activation. But you could imagine there's other inflammatory diseases that also respond to IL-6 and other ones that respond or don't respond to mTOR inhibition. And thinking about this more in terms of like what's the critical driver. And so rather than calling it Castleman's responds to an IL-6 blocker and RA that responds to an IL-6 blocker, just think about it as these are like, 2 sides of one IL-6opathy, where like you got to give them an IL-6 blocker because that's the way you're going to treat it. I think that's a cool way to think about the future because the only reason to really put a name on a disease is that way you can figure out how do you take care of it. I don't know. Maybe I don't know if any other ideas come to you, but that's the only thing that really comes to me is like, why is it so important to put a name on it and, to define your disease? Well, it's so that you can treat it. And if naming it helps you to actually treat it better in that sort of context, then I think that'd be really exciting. Yeah. Can you think of other reasons for why we need to put a particular name or diagnosis beyond just so that we can treat it better?
No, that's unbelievable. You just gave me goosebumps saying it because 3 specialties and all these years in, I never thought of it that way. A diagnosis, what is the purpose of a diagnosis?
Right?
Shakespearean, what is in a name than other than
something?
Same thing. It's like it's literally to guide, to get you all the way down to
so
what you can do to undo the disease process, right? And that's very interesting because we talk about this precision model for like accounting everything about yourself. At the end of the day, and in cancer at least, we say this, like, are we really going to care if it's a carcinoma or breast, this, that, and the other triple negative? These are all definitions. But if we just have a true like footprint of everything on a molecular RNA microenvironment, that at the end of the day, that's what matters. And this is a very interesting concept that you're saying. I'll give you one example. I was doing a talk for a conference a week ago, and I found a study to give the example of machine learning that can tell EGFR positivity, which is an aggressive factor in lung cancer. And I thought it was going to talk about the gradient drop off of the avidity of a PET scan and some kind of features just very characteristic of the lesion itself. But what it did was it said, okay, when it had contralateral lesions on 2 different areas and had pleural involvement, all of these things that you wouldn't really know to what you started this conversation with, this podcast, about point you in the right direction, it was hitting like 85, 90% on being able to see it. But it didn't include just the avidity of the PET scan. Again, it had these like random features. In a way, that's what Castleman and Poems, a lot of these things are. It's like, okay, lymph nodes that are bulky, these things that we know are inflammation, ferritin high because it's an inflammation marker. But if you feed all of this in a multimodal fashion, to your point where you said you don't want to be one-dimensional because you want to hedge your bets the best you can, and in your humility, in our humility, not believe or determine if something is or isn't relevant, just give it all and let someone else do it that can do things in parallel much better than a human brain can, then the hope is you can actually start defining, whether you have a name or not, an eponym or not, really, distill down what is likely or unlikely. Is it not Castleman's because the way that the lymph node grows, is different immunologic process than the way that, one that's IL-6 driven. Like, who knows, right? But I think that really is a phase 2 approach of kind of thinking about maybe decreasing the misses by not having a candidacy for something that otherwise is just you're misclassified, but by current criteria it is. And that would be the next challenge, is to make sure that now it's the actual disease process and less so the name.
I love that idea. And I think that what we're doing, I think, would be well positioned to be able to make that sort of a shift from the, eponymous way of naming things, Castleman's or Sjogren's or whatever it might be, towards something that's more mechanism driven. So yeah, it's awesome.
Well, David, I'm so very grateful, first and foremost, for what you're doing for us, as a human existence, and two, for being on this podcast, but that's a much smaller piece. Is there anything that someone can do if they just believe in your mission and stuff? Can they just share their data, or, you'd mentioned being able to access it during a problem, but I've learned, and very encouragingly, people just want to help. They're let's just do better in medicine. Any suggestions?
Yeah, thanks, Sanjay. So the first thing that anyone listening can do is go to everycare.org/ideas. So if you have an idea for a drug that could be repurposed, maybe you've treated a patient with a drug and it really helped them, or maybe it didn't help them. But particularly drugs that are off-label or repurposed drugs, go to everycare.org/ideas. If you like what we're doing and you're what, I'd love to volunteer my time. If they ever come up with something for sickle cell disease, I'm a sickle cell disease expert. I would love to help them. You can go to everycare.org/experts and you can sign up and basically say hey, if there's a disease that meets my expertise, I'm here to help you. I'm happy to review it. I'm happy to tell you it's a horrible idea
awesome.
Or it's a good idea. But anyone and everyone that's in the medical field can do that. Anyone can, and regardless of the medical field, can share your ideas. If you're a patient, tell us what's worked for you. And then, of course, the other two things that anyone and everyone can do is to donate to our work at everycare.org/donate. We're a nonprofit organization. We're trying our best to do as many clinical trials and laboratories as we can, and they're all expensive. And then the last thing is to help to raise awareness. So sometimes we find medicines where they clearly work. We just need to get the word out about them. And so that might just be as simple as, sharing one of our posts or maybe forwarding along an email, but helping to get the word out is really important, because as I said earlier, there's never been an effort like this that's had no profit motive. We're a nonprofit. We don't own any of the drugs. We don't have any diseases of interest that are we have to work on. We're just looking for the best opportunities to help people. But we really can't do it alone. We really, really need everyone listening to this podcast and everyone not listening to this podcast to be a part of this, because we got a great opportunity to help people. But we really need an army to work on this.
My heart's beating out of my chest right now. I feel like I just either run through a wall on the screen. So, David, thank you so much for what you're doing. And I hope anyone that heard this and listening is also equally inspired.
Well, thanks so much, Sanjay. This has been so fun.